Hello again. Tonight unfolds around Mara, a woman who mastered the art of escaping her own grief by living entirely above her shoulders, until a quiet, patient yoga instructor guided her back into breath, sensation, and something that felt dangerously close to love. Sometimes the very body we avoid becomes the first place that feels like home again. By the time Mara admitted she needed help, she had become exceptionally skilled at pretending she didn't. Her life ran with surgical precision. Emails answered within minutes. Presentations delivered flawlessly under impossible timelines. Groceries organized through a color-coded system. Weekly calls with her father that never stretched beyond 18 minutes. Even her mornings were calibrated, the sharp whir of her coffee grinder at 6:30 sounding less like comfort and more like machinery in a sterile clinic. To anyone watching, she looked functional, impressive even. A little intense, perhaps a little sleep-deprived, but thriving in that particular restrained, curated way that passed for wellness in her world. She moved through her days with her jaw clenched, shoulders lifted just slightly too high, lungs pulling in only the bare minimum required to remain upright. Still, she remembered to soften her tone in messages, adding exclamation points so no one would mistake her for unhappy. 16 months earlier, her younger brother had died on a rain-slick highway, his small blue car crushed into a story delivered in person by a state trooper. That moment had split her life cleanly in two. She came to understand grief not just as a singular event, but as an atmosphere. The event was sharp and defined, but the aftermath lingered like a shift in climate. Everything remained in place. Stores open, routines intact, laughter still possible. But nothing followed the same rules. The air itself felt altered, sound carrying differently, time refusing to settle into anything stable. Her therapist, a woman with a calm, practiced patience, once asked what was happening inside her body. Mara answered plainly. She was avoiding it. Talking helped, but only to a point. She still experienced everything from a distance, narrating her life as if hovering just outside of it. Eventually, the suggestion came: yoga, somatic work, something that might bring her back into herself. She resisted with sharp, practiced skepticism, dismissing it as something performative, something trivial. But resistance had started to crack under the weight of her own exhaustion. 2 weeks later, she found herself filling out an intake form for a private session with a somatic yoga instructor named Iris Vane. She kept her answers safe and impersonal: stress, tension, poor sleep, a desire to relax. Nowhere did she write the truth. That her brother's absence had hollowed her out. That her body carried a quiet punishment for surviving. That there were boxes in her apartment she couldn't bring herself to open. As if touching his things might betray him. The appointment was set for a gray November afternoon. The kind of day where the sky flattened into a dull, endless thought and rain polished the streets into reflective silence. She drove across the river after work, irritation simmering under her skin, every delay in traffic feeling like a personal offense. The studio sat quietly in a modest, carefully kept neighborhood. Nothing flashy. Just old trees, low fences, and houses that held their space without demanding attention. The building itself was simple. Dark cedar softened by rain, a paper lantern glowing faintly beneath the eaves. For a moment Mara lingered outside, tempted to retreat, to fabricate an urgent email, to return to the safety of her controlled world. The urge felt almost adolescent in its intensity. But she stepped inside anyway. Warmth wrapped around her immediately, fogging her glasses before the room came into focus. Pale wood floors, neatly arranged props, soft filtered light slipping through rice paper screens. The air carried a subtle blend of sandalwood and citrus, clean without being artificial. Everything about the space felt intentional, cared for. Then Iris appeared. She wasn't striking in an obvious way, but there was something about her presence that steadied the room itself. Taller than expected, composed without effort, her movements unhurried. Her gaze rested on Mara with quiet attention. Not searching, not judging, simply observing. Their introduction was brief, uncomplicated. Iris offered tea or water, accepted Mara's quick refusal without comment, and guided her gently into the space. They sat across from each other, and the questions began. Simple, precise, almost disarming in how directly they landed: work, sleep, energy, pain, boundaries. When Iris asked what general stress actually meant in her life, Mara defaulted to something polished, rehearsed: deadlines, overwork, difficulty switching off. But the words hung there, incomplete. Rain tapped softly against the windows, as silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Mara admitted that what she said was true, but not the whole truth. There was no pressure from Iris, no attempt to extract more than she was ready to give. Only a quiet acknowledgement that deeper care required honesty. Even if it came slowly, Mara deflected, tried to regain control with humor edged in defensiveness. But the steadiness across from her didn't shift. It didn't push, didn't retreat. When she finally admitted she felt disconnected from her own body, the word uncomfortable was offered back to her. It felt absurdly insufficient. A sharp, unexpected laugh escaped her, and then just as quickly, tears followed. Immediate, uninvited, as though something inside her had been waiting for the smallest opening. Embarrassment flooded in just as fast. But Iris didn't rush to fix it, didn't dramatize it, didn't soften it with cliches. She simply allowed it to exist. And in that quiet acceptance, Mara found herself without the defenses she had relied on for so long. Left there, in the unfamiliar weight of being fully present, with nothing to shield her from what she actually felt. She didn't move closer, didn't fill the space with reassurances or instructions. She simply remained where she was, steady and present in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, as if Mara had forgotten that kind of attention existed. Gradually, the uneven rhythm of her breathing softened. The sharp edges inside her eased just enough for her to sit upright again, without feeling like she had been pieced together from fragments. After a while, Iris spoke gently, suggesting they keep things simple. No performance, no striving, just noticing. The word itself carried a quiet weight. Mara met it with suspicion, sensing the territory it might lead into. But Iris answered without shifting tone, grounding the idea in something tangible. Gravity, the floor beneath her, the undeniable fact of being held up by something steady. That, strangely, made trust feel possible. She was guided to stand at the top of the mat, not to fix anything, not to improve, but to observe. It was unsettling how quickly she realized she leaned forward, her weight gathered in the balls of her feet, as if her body had been preparing to flee for months without her permission. A subtle bend in her knees, a softening of her jaw, her arms hanging loose. Small adjustments that felt less like correction and more like permission. Her breath, Iris explained, didn't need to deepen yet, it only needed to be allowed. They moved slowly, hands and knees, spine shifting gently through familiar shapes, a supported child's pose, softened with blankets where her body resisted, a low lunge that revealed just how deeply her hips distrusted release. Each time she pushed, even slightly, Iris would intervene with the same quiet instruction, less ambition. The simplicity of it irritated her. Beneath that irritation was something more difficult to admit. A quiet, persistent desire to earn approval. Not attraction, not anything she could name easily. Just a need to see that calm, steady face reflect something back to her. Lying on her back later, knees bent and falling inward, Iris asked if she could feel the back of her ribs. Mara answered intellectually at first, grasping for the correct response. But Iris gently redirected her away from understanding and toward sensation. When permission was asked to place a hand on her lower ribs, Mara agreed almost automatically. It was just a hand, after all, but when that hand settled, light, grounded, without demand, it stirred something deeper than she expected. Not desire, not even comfort. Something older, quieter, recognition perhaps, or the unfamiliar experience of being touched without expectation. She was told not to force the breath, to let it arrive on its own, to allow the exhale to lengthen. She tried, though her throat tightened inexplicably, emotion rising without a clear reason. Later, supported in a forward fold, her body cushioned by blankets and bolsters, the room fell into a deep, attentive quiet. Small sounds surfaced, the soft click of a kettle shutting off, a car passing through rain outside. And then the tears came again, sudden and overwhelming. Not restrained or graceful, but raw, disoriented, as if something inside her had mistaken stillness for safety and seized its chance to break free. Instinctively, she tried to pull away, to apologize, to contain it. But Iris's voice remained low, steady, asking only for one more breath where she was. Mara didn't know if she could. The uncertainty itself felt enormous. Then came the lightest pressure of a hand between her shoulder blades. No movement, no attempt to soothe or fix. Just presence, warm and steady. Under that touch, something shifted. It wasn't comfort that met her first, but honesty. A sharp, undeniable awareness that she could not hide from what she was feeling. Not from Iris, and not from herself. So she stayed. One breath, then another, the intensity changed shape. The panic dissolved into something slower, broader, like weather passing through rather than a storm breaking her apart. Iris said nothing more until Mara's breathing settled into something steady again. When the session ended, Mara felt undone in a way that was impossible to disguise. Her face flushed, her hair loose, her composure dismantled by something as simple as a stretch. Iris handed her water without ceremony, treating the moment as ordinary rather than fragile. Near the doorway, as she put her shoes back on, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the session had been a lot. Mara deflected with humor, dismissing the posture that had unraveled her, but the tension had already softened. A small laugh slipped out despite herself. When asked if she would return, every instinct suggested she shouldn't. This place, this work. It felt too honest, too exposing. It threatened the carefully constructed distance she had relied on for so long. And yet, what came out was uncertainty instead of refusal. A quiet maybe, which Iris accepted without pressure, leaving the door open without expectation. Outside, the evening air was cool and damp, the sky dimming into blue-gray. As Mara walked back to her car, she felt emptied and oddly precise, as if something inside her had been clarified rather than broken. At a stoplight on the drive home, she noticed her shoulders had dropped, just slightly, away from the tension they had carried for so long. The change was small, almost imperceptible, but it unsettled her. It also compelled her. Before the hesitation could return, she booked another session. The second visit began with resistance dressed as humor. She reported soreness as if filing a complaint, unsure whether it belonged to physical strain or something less tangible. Iris received it calmly, reframing it as unfamiliar work rather than damage, and promised to keep things gentle. The studio felt the same, warm, grounded, quietly consistent. Yet something in Mara shifted the moment she stepped onto the wooden floor. The instinct to brace weakened slightly, and she resented that. Attachment to a place like this felt dangerous, like the beginning of dependence. Still, she noticed more this time. The details of Iris's presence, the way her movements revealed strength without effort, small changes she hadn't registered before. It was as if part of her had begun cataloging these things without permission, memorizing them despite herself. The focus that day was breath. The simplicity of it felt almost insulting at first. But she followed the instructions, lying back with support beneath her spine. Her chest opened in a way that felt exposed, almost indecent. Light filtered softly through the room, the quiet wrapping around her. Iris stayed nearby but not looming, her voice guiding rather than directing. The work was subtle, inhale, exhale, lengthening without force. Explanations followed, grounding the practice in physiology, giving Mara something to understand, something to analyze. For a while, she clung to that. But even that was gently interrupted. She was told she was thinking her way through it again, observing from a distance rather than feeling from within. Reluctantly, she tried to shift. At first, it was unbearable. Her mind raced through tasks, responsibilities, trivial details. The absurdity of the situation pressed in on her. Lying there, counting breaths, paying for something that seemed so simple. Then, almost imperceptibly, something changed. The breath stopped feeling like a task. The exhale stretched a little further. Her ribs moved under her skin in a way that startled her. There was grief there, undeniably, but also breath, also life. She traced where the breath caught, where it hesitated, not everywhere at once, but in one small place. Her lower ribs, perhaps. She placed her hands there, feeling the faint expansion, barely noticeable but real. The shifts were subtle, almost invisible. But from the inside, they mattered. By the end, sitting with her back against the wall, one hand on her chest and the other on her abdomen, she searched for what she felt. The expected answer hovered. Calm, steady, acceptable, but the truth arrived first. Anger, not loud or explosive, but clear. Directed at the fact that something so small, so simple, could actually work. That after everything, after all the distance and control, her body could still respond. Iris didn't explain it away. She didn't analyze or soften it. She allowed it to exist fully intact. Later, walking back to her car, something surfaced from memory. Her brother as a boy, resisting chores, exaggerating his complaints with theatrical flair. The image arrived uninvited, vivid and immediate, as if something inside her had begun to loosen just enough to let him through again. He had thrown himself backward into a pile of leaves twice his size, arms flung wide in theatrical surrender, declaring with exaggerated solemnity that if this counted as labor exploitation, he wanted it formally recorded that he objected. The performance had been perfect, but it was the laugh that followed that stayed. The slight hitch at the end, as if even his own joy had caught him off guard, sitting in her car now, rain stitching fine lines across the windshield. Mara found herself holding the steering wheel without moving. not thinking about the accident or the sterile absence of a hospital room that never held him, but about leaves tangled in his hair and the worn orange sweatshirt he refused to replace, long after the cuffs had faded into gray. By the third session, familiarity had quietly taken root. She no longer checked the email for directions. She knew where to park, knew the subtle scent that would greet her inside: wood, tea, and something deliberately restrained that never tipped into perfume. The space had become predictable in small ways. 2 mats waiting, hers always placed slightly closer to the softened light of the rice paper screens. A folded blanket positioned at the top, as if her body's complaints had already been anticipated and accommodated. What she hadn't expected was the way her body had begun to anticipate the hour itself, with a quiet, almost stubborn devotion she would have once found ridiculous. When asked about her week, she answered automatically, defaulting to productivity as proof of existence. But when the question shifted, how her body had been, something in her paused long enough to notice the difference. The answer came out simpler, less polished: tired. The follow-up question invited specificity, and she responded with a dry honesty that carried more truth than she intended. Her neck, her hips, her entire personality, they began with slow, deliberate movement. Cat and cow, the spine easing into motion. A standing half-lift supported by blocks. Forward folds approached carefully, knees bent enough to allow space rather than strain. Iris spoke sparingly, each cue precise and grounded. Root through the base of the big toe. Soften the back of the tongue. Let the head hang with weight instead of force. When Iris demonstrated, her body moved without display, without the sharp edge of performance. It didn't showcase flexibility. It embodied agreement, as if every part of her had consented to the same quiet alignment. At one point, standing close, Iris asked permission to adjust her pelvis. The language was clinical, but the moment carried something else beneath it. Mara agreed, steadying herself for something she couldn't quite name. The contact was minimal. Hands resting lightly at her hips, guiding a subtle shift so small it would have gone unnoticed without that touch. There was nothing overtly intimate in it, nothing lingering, and yet her entire system responded. Something along the back of her body lengthened. The tight, restless grip beneath her ribs eased, not through effort, not through intention, but because some deeper part of her recognized the presence of care and stepped back from its constant vigilance. The shift came so quickly it unsettled her. Her body almost recoiled, the instinct to pull away rising just as fast as the release had arrived. The adjustment stopped immediately. When asked if it had been too much, she struggled to answer. The truth hovered just out of reach of language. It hadn't been pain, hadn't been discomfort in the way she understood those things. It had been something quieter, more disorienting. A brief disappearance into herself. A moment where everything unnecessary fell away. What remained was silence. That was the only word she could offer, though it felt insufficient. Iris received it with a subtle recognition. Something soft passing through her expression. Sometimes alignment feels like quiet. The rest of the session unfolded under that awareness. Mara moved carefully, as if avoiding direct contact with something too bright to look at fully. Supported shapes, gentle forward folds, her body resting against bolsters that held more of her weight than she was accustomed to allowing. She was asked to let herself settle completely, to release the subtle effort of hovering just above support. The request landed deeper than it should have. Holding herself just above everything had long been her most reliable skill. Still, she let go. Her forehead rested on her arms. The faint scent of clean cotton and sandalwood filled the small space beneath her breath. Around her, the quiet was alive with small, almost invisible movements. Iris shifting somewhere nearby, fabric brushing softly, footsteps placed with deliberate care. Then it came again. Not happiness, not relief, but the sudden absence of a familiar alarm. A stillness that felt both fragile and immense. It lasted only seconds, just long enough to feel impossible. When she rose from it, the anger returned, but it no longer stood alone. It brought fear with it, and something sharper, harder to dismiss. Curiosity edged with distrust. A pull toward something she wasn't ready to name. Iris observed her with a clarity that felt almost unnerving, describing her expression as if she were watching someone resist an answer they already understood. The accuracy of it landed uncomfortably. They moved on, stretching, adjusting, continuing the quiet work. By the fourth session, Mara arrived carrying noise. Work had been relentless in its artificial urgency, language inflated to disguise emptiness. Conversations filled with phrases that sounded important but meant very little. Even her call with her father had left a residue. His careful, indirect concern met with her own sharp deflection, leaving both of them somewhere colder than before. The tension followed her into the studio. This time, she filled the space before anything else could. Words came quickly, spilling out as she moved, as she set up, as she followed instructions. Observations, complaints, analysis. Everything that could keep the room at a distance. She spoke through every posture, every transition, aware of it and unable to stop. The talking became a shield, a way to prevent anything quieter from surfacing. Iris allowed it for a while. She made small adjustments, offered occasional guidance, never interrupting the flow directly. Then, at a moment when Mara was suspended in a supported bridge, still speaking, Iris said her name. The sound cut cleanly through everything else. What followed was simple, a request for silence, just for 3 breaths. Not a command, not a correction. A question posed with genuine curiosity. The absence of judgment made it harder to resist. Reluctantly, she agreed. The first breath stretched longer than expected. Without words to occupy the space, sensation moved forward. She noticed the pressure of her tongue against the roof of her mouth, the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. On the exhale, emotion rose suddenly, without explanation, pressing upward, without attaching itself to language. The second breath brought awareness to her body. The support beneath her, the unfamiliar openness in her hips, the way her body was being asked to exist without bracing. And then, without warning, memory surfaced. Her brother again, kneeling on her apartment floor months before he died, wrestling with incomprehensible assembly instructions, joking about falling in battle against furniture design. The image arrived fully formed, absurd and vivid and alive. The sound that escaped her was caught between laughter and grief. By the third breath, the tears came. This time, she didn't fight them as hard. She stayed where she was, supported, letting the sensation move through instead of forcing it back. The tears slipped quietly into her hair, less foreign now, less unwelcome than they had been before. Later, sitting across from Iris in the dimming room, rain tracing slow paths down the glass, there was an acknowledgement that she didn't have to reveal everything all at once. Mara deflected, insisting she wasn't. But the truth lingered between them anyway. Even all her talking, all the noise she had brought with her, had only ever been a distraction, a carefully constructed decoy meant to keep the real thing just out of reach. 4 sessions had passed, and still she had never said it. Not brother, not dead, not accident, not even his name. She had circled the truth carefully, offering only the atmosphere around it, never the thing itself. It was like describing the weather while standing at the edge of a crater, pretending the ground beneath her wasn't hollowed out. At a red light on Hawthorne, idling behind a bicyclist in a bright yellow rain shell, the realization came with a quiet, unsettling clarity. She was changing. Not in any dramatic or graceful way, not in a way anyone else would notice, but undeniably. Something in her had shifted direction. Her body was no longer just a vehicle carrying her from one task to the next. It had become a place where things surfaced without permission. Sensations, memories, truths she hadn't approved. That loss of control felt dangerous. It also carried a strange, reluctant sense of relief she wasn't ready to admit. The following Saturday, she ran into Iris at the farmer's market. The morning held that familiar gray brightness, the kind that pretended to be light until you looked too closely. The market was crowded despite the cold, filled with people wrapped in layers, moving between striped tents with coffee cups in hand, participating in the quiet ritual of choosing fresh things in a season that offered very little. Mara had gone for practical reasons. She needed greens, and her apartment had started to feel stale after days of rain. Her bag already held sourdough, leeks, and an overly ambitious amount of parsley. She spotted Iris first, standing near a fruit stall, turning a persimmon slowly in her hand as if it required careful consideration. The sight of her outside the studio disrupted something internal. The context had changed, and with it, the shape of everything Mara thought she understood. Iris wore a dark wool coat, a scarf the color of rust looped loosely at her throat. Her hair was down, not fully loose, but enough to soften her presence in a way that felt disarming. For a brief moment, Mara considered retreating, slipping behind a display, and preserving the clean boundary of their professional distance. But Iris looked up, saw her, and recognition lit her expression instantly. It was unguarded, immediate, and it landed somewhere deep in Mara's chest. She approached, masking her hesitation with dry humor, commenting on the unexpected fact that Iris apparently bought fruit like a normal person. The response she received wasn't the small, controlled smile she knew from their sessions. It was a real laugh, open, unrestrained, carrying warmth without calculation. That was the moment everything sharpened. The awareness arrived all at once. She had been thinking about Iris constantly. Not just before sessions, not just in a practical sense tied to the work they were doing. Constantly, small details had accumulated without her consent. The tone of her voice when she said less ambition, the way she handled objects with quiet care, the angle of her wrist pouring tea. She had been carrying these observations like something harmless, labeling it curiosity, when it had already become something else. Their conversations stayed light, grounded in ordinary things. Food, winter, small jokes that passed easily between them. But even the simplest details seemed to land with unexpected weight. The fact that Iris cooked more when it was cold. The casual way she held the fruit. These fragments entered Mara's awareness and settled there, impossible to ignore. At one point, their shoulders brushed briefly as they stepped aside for someone passing through. The contact was minimal, almost accidental, but it registered fully, a line of sensation traveling down her side before she could dismiss it. The question she asked next came out before she could filter it, sounding more intentional than she meant. It exposed something she hadn't yet defined. Iris answered simply, without reading into it, but the moment lingered. The world around them continued as normal. Verters calling out, paper bags shifting, the hiss of espresso machines. But for a brief stretch of time, it felt like they had stepped outside the structure that usually contained them. No mats, no instructions, no careful navigation of breath and feeling. Just two people standing under a tent, talking about fruit while the threat of rain hovered overhead. It was disorienting. Mara ended the interaction before it could extend into something she didn't understand, offering a casual farewell that felt anything but casual. Iris's gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, steady and present, in a way that stayed with her even after she walked away. Back home, Mara stood in her kitchen, groceries unpacked, coffee cooling untouched in her hand. The realization settled in slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as something undeniable once acknowledged. What unsettled her most wasn't simply the fact that her attention had shifted toward a woman. It was the specificity of it. This wasn't abstract admiration or distant recognition of beauty. It was precise, it had shape, it had weight. She could recall the sound of Iris's laugh, the way it seemed to loosen something inside her chest. She could picture her alone at the market, and recognize that it mattered to her in a way she couldn't explain. She found herself wondering what she would cook with the fruit she had chosen. As if that detail held significance beyond reason, she spent the rest of the day trying to contain it, to translate it into something manageable. The word she reached for was clinical, transference. It offered structure, a framework that made the experience feel explainable. Of course she felt attached. Iris represented safety, care, competence. The reaction was predictable, even expected. But the explanation didn't hold completely. It didn't account for the way her thoughts returned, uninvited, to the curve of Iris's mouth when she laughed. It didn't account for the quiet pull she felt, the curiosity that had deepened into something harder to dismiss. By December, the sessions had taken on a different gravity. One Thursday evening, the darkness arrived early, the rain sharper, colder. Mara reached the studio ahead of time, unable to remain alone with her thoughts any longer. Standing under the awning, listening to water move through the gutters, she recognized the choice in front of her with stark clarity. She could leave. She could preserve the structure of her life exactly as it had been, controlled, articulate, shaped by familiar forms of distance. Instead, she opened the door. Warmth met her immediately. Inside, Iris looked up from preparing the space, acknowledging her early arrival without probing. Tea was offered, and this time Mara accepted. They sat together in the small adjoining kitchen, a space she had only glimpsed before. It was simple, lived in without excess. Open shelves, stacked bowls, a vase holding bare branches. The window above the sink carried a faint fog along its edges. Iris poured tea without asking for preferences, the liquid a deep amber color that carried warmth through the cup and into Mara's hands. The flavor was layered, ginger, something softer beneath it. She held it carefully, feeling the heat return to her fingers. When Iris observed that she seemed tired, Mara deflected lightly, but the follow-up question lingered longer than expected. Whether it was the season or something more specific, the answer came quietly: December. There was a pause, not empty but attentive. Then a question, framed with the same careful neutrality Iris always used, as if speaking about weather patterns rather than personal loss. Mara responded before she could reconsider. Her brother's birthday was in December. The words landed flat, stripped of inflection, but their weight filled the space immediately. It was the first time she had said it out loud in that room. Even that small acknowledgement felt like stepping onto unstable ground and hearing it hold, just barely. Iris set her cup down and thanked her. The response could have irritated her. It felt insufficient, almost too simple for the gravity of what had been said. But the irritation didn't take hold. Exhaustion had worn down her ability to resist. They moved into the studio with the quiet understanding that something had shifted. The session was gentle, built around support rather than effort. Bolsters, blankets, blocks arranged with quiet intention, as if the space itself had been prepared to hold something heavier than usual. The movements were slow, almost still, restorative shapes that asked nothing except presence. Her body was guided into positions that removed the need to perform, to prove anything through flexibility or control. Iris remained nearby, present without crowding, allowing space without absence. When she suggested moving even more slowly, Mara responded with instinctive resistance, but it lacked its usual sharpness. There are points in grief where exhaustion makes truth easier than avoidance, she agreed. Time stretched differently in that session, unfolding without urgency. Each position held long enough for sensation to surface, for the edges of awareness to soften. Eventually, the invitation came, not for the full story, not for explanation, but for something simpler, to name what was present. Mara hesitated, and for once, she didn't have an answer ready. The answer existed somewhere, but it hadn't found language yet. She lay on her side, her face turned toward the floor, close enough to see the fine lines in the wood grain. The room held a kind of quiet that wasn't empty but contained, steady. Rain moved softly against the roof, the heater ticking faintly along the wall, her own breath uneven in her chest. And then it slipped out before she could stop it, Cal. His name landed in the room like something breaking open and being released at the same time. Just one syllable, impossibly small for the weight it carried. It felt absurd that an entire person could be held inside a sound like that. More absurd that speaking it didn't shatter the space around her. The tears came immediately, but not like before. Not sudden, startled, or apologetic. This was slower, heavier. Saying his name had opened something sealed deep inside her, a room where the air had not shifted since the day he died. Everything in it felt preserved, untouched, unchanged. Iris didn't move closer. She didn't interrupt the moment. Her voice came softly, steady enough that it almost blended into the quiet. Cal. Hearing it return to her felt different. His name hadn't been spoken aloud like that in months, not with any ease. With her father, it carried a fragile weight, something both of them handled carefully, as if it might crack between them. Here, it didn't shrink or fracture. It simply existed, fully present. When Mara's breathing steadied enough to hold words again, she was guided toward something simple. Not the whole story, not the loss in its entirety, just one true thing. The specificity left her exposed in a way she couldn't avoid. He hated bananas, she said. Not in recipes or disguised in food, but as a thing in itself. The texture offended him on a level he treated as moral. The memory rose easily, absurd and precise, and something in Iris's expression softened to meet it. There had been many opinions like that. As children, he had declared things cancelled with dramatic finality. Bananas, church shoes, anyone who used certain words he disliked. The memory unfolded with a strange lightness threaded through it, humor and grief moving side by side instead of replacing each other. Another truth followed. He made playlists for everything. Not general ones, but hyper-specific collections that only made sense to him. Music for driving at night with a sense of superiority. Music for rain that wasn't sad. Once, he had made one for her with a title that felt like both a joke and a quiet accusation. Songs for when you pretend you don't need me but clearly do. The tears didn't stop, but they changed. They no longer blocked speech. They moved alongside it, making space for memory instead of swallowing it whole. She lay supported, her body arranged with care, one hand resting over her abdomen because that was where she had needed contact. The guidance remained steady, drawing her attention not away from the grief but into it, anchoring it in something physical. Her throat held tension, tight and hot beneath her fingers when she touched it. Her chest carried something different, not centered but slightly to the left, a dull, bruised sensation that felt both specific and impossible to explain. She stayed with it. And then the memories came more fully. The way he laughed, just before delivering a joke that landed somewhere between sharp and affectionate. The old sweatshirt he wore until it had more history than fabric. His inability to care for plants, contrasted with his habit of collecting stray animals as if they belonged to him by default. A pigeon once, injured and stubborn. A half-eared cat. A dog that simply followed him home and stayed. At 26, he still called their mother for instructions on laundry, convinced care labels were written by liars. The last message he sent, a photograph of an absurdly overfilled sandwich, towering and ridiculous, accompanied by a caption that turned even something small into humor. The words continued as her body shifted through gentle, supported positions. Movement and memory intertwined in a way that felt unfamiliar but undeniable. Each time the grief sharpened too suddenly, she was guided back to something concrete. The weight of her heels, the contact of fabric against her skin, the slow length of her breath. Not as distraction, but as companionship within the experience. Eventually, something more fragile surfaced. She spoke about the sweatshirt. How she had brought his things home with the intention of sorting them, and then hadn't. How she had avoided washing that one piece because it had carried his scent for a while, fading slowly until she no longer knew what she was holding on to. Dust, maybe. Or the idea that touching it too much might erase whatever trace remained. The thought broke her voice. Iris remained close, present without intrusion, acknowledging the instinct behind it. The attempt to preserve something intangible through careful avoidance. It wasn't logical, but it was deeply human. That dual truth settled between them. Irrational and valid at the same time, not opposing, not canceling each other out. When asked to name something difficult about him, something unpolished by loss, the answer came more quickly than expected. Death had a way of turning people into something untouchable, and he would have rejected that completely. He had been frustrating. Careless with borrowed things. Late to everything. Relying on charm to smooth over irritation. He provoked arguments at family dinners simply because silence bored him. He flirted without restraint, treating it like a public service rather than a personal impulse. And in speaking those things, he became more present. Not less, there he is. Not past tense. Not reduced to memory alone. Something about the way it was said allowed him to exist in the room as more than absence. Mara felt it. The exchange that followed shifted subtly, something unspoken passing between them. It wasn't named, wasn't acted upon, but it registered all the same. A current beneath the surface. Felt before it was understood. Iris turned her attention away gently, breaking the moment without disrupting it, returning to the quiet work of arranging the space. The session ended in stillness. Covered with a blanket, her body finally registering the chill she hadn't noticed, Mara lay with her arm resting open beside her. When Iris's hand settled lightly over her forearm, it wasn't to guide or correct, it was simply there, steady, unobtrusive, accompanying rather than leading. In that quiet, with tears drying against her skin and the faint weight of another person's presence grounding her, a realization formed with exhausted clarity. If she were ever to fully unravel, it would happen like this. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a warm room filled with quiet, with someone nearby who didn't demand that her pain be translated into something neat or understandable. Afterward, they returned to the kitchen. More tea, because she wasn't ready to step back into the mechanics of the outside world. Rain streaked the window dark, the evening settling in fully. Iris offered simple guidance. Eat something warm, expect sensitivity. Understand that intensity didn't mean something was wrong. The explanation was brief but carried weight. Grief moves when it is given space. There was something personal in that statement, something lived rather than studied. Mara noticed it, recognized the echo of a story she hadn't been told. She wanted to ask, but didn't. The impulse felt too sharp, too consuming. Instead, she offered thanks, keeping it contained. When she returned home, she went directly to the corner she had avoided for over a year. The bin sat beneath the window, the duffel bag leaning against them as if waiting. She crouched there still wearing her coat, not touching anything yet, only looking. The room split itself into two distinct worlds. Ordinary life arranged neatly in one half, the quiet, unresolved presence of her brother occupying the other. Finally, she reached for the sweatshirt, once blue, now faded into something softer. Worn down by time and used into a color that belonged somewhere between memory and dusk. The cuffs were worn rough from years of use, the fabric thinning where his wrists had once moved through it. One sleeve still carried a darkened grease stain that had never washed out, stubborn and ordinary in a way that felt almost deliberate. She lifted the sweatshirt to her face and breathed in, but there was nothing left of him in it. No trace of scent, no echo of presence. Just cotton, dust, and time. She sank back onto her heels, the fabric gathered in her hands, and cried until her throat ached. Not because she had found him again, and not because she had lost him all over. The grief came from something quieter, more precise. The realization that she could finally feel the difference between those two things. December slipped into January without ceremony. The city shifted from one shade of darkness into another, marginally lighter but no less heavy. New Year's passed in damp bursts of fireworks over the river, distant and muted. She stood on her fire escape wrapped in a blanket, the cold pressing through the metal beneath her feet, texting her father at midnight, because calling felt like more than she could manage. The sessions continued. They didn't become easier, not in any simple sense, but they grew more honest. She arrived with less armor each time, and the absence of it made her feel exposed in ways that bordered on embarrassing. There was nowhere left to hide behind efficiency or detachment. One week focused on balance, revealing how her toes curled tightly against the floor whenever she felt uncertain, as if she could anchor herself by gripping hard enough. Another week brought stillness, a seated body scan that exposed entire systems of tension she hadn't known existed, especially in her jaw, where strain gathered like weather waiting to break. On a week when her neck had tightened into something nearly unbearable after too many presentations, Iris showed her how to use a strap to open her shoulders without forcing them, guiding her out of the habit of turning every stretch into something aggressive. The instructions remained simple, exact. Soften the front ribs. Let the shoulder blade descend. Imagine space where there had only been effort. She resented how effective those words were, and beneath it all something else shifted. At first she tried to contain it, translating it into language that felt safe, clinical, attachment, transference, a nervous system responding to regulation. She could have mapped it, explained it, justified it. There were frameworks for this, theories that reduced complexity into something manageable. But none of them accounted for the specificity. The way her attention lingered on small details she hadn't chosen to notice. A faint scar near Iris's wrist, barely visible unless you were looking for it. The way she declined honey in her tea with quiet certainty, preferring bitterness without apology. The small, almost unconscious gesture of tucking her hair behind one ear, revealing something fleeting and balanced that felt strangely intimate. This wasn't abstraction. It wasn't generalized admiration. It was precise. Gratitude didn't behave like this. Gratitude didn't imagine the warmth of her kitchen late at night, or wonder how her laughter sounded when no one was there to witness it. Gratitude didn't cling to passing remarks, didn't replay them later with new meaning attached. There had been a moment, casual and unremarkable at the time, when Iris mentioned an ex. The word she used had been she. It had landed quietly then, but later it shifted something fundamental. The understanding moved through her not as shock, but as recognition delayed too long. Looking back, the signs had always been there. In college, there had been an attachment she had disguised as academic interest, redirecting her focus just enough to make it seem intentional. Later, a relationship with a man who checked every box on paper but never quite aligned in practice. His presence feeling subtly wrong in a way she had attributed to fear, to grief, to some internal flaw. It hadn't occurred to her then that wrong could simply mean wrong. The realization arrived gradually, like light changing in a room, until suddenly everything looked different. Then one afternoon, standing in the office kitchen, it became unavoidable. A coworker asked her out. He was kind, composed, the kind of person she would have said yes to without hesitation before. And for a moment, she almost did. The reflex was still there, familiar and automatic. But something held her back that evening. Alone with the quiet hum of the city beyond her windows, she let the truth settle fully. She wanted Iris, not conceptually, not as a projection or a substitute for something else. Specifically, inconveniently, as a woman. The realization didn't explode into panic. It rearranged things. Quietly, thoroughly. The structure of her life shifted without asking permission, revealing spaces she hadn't acknowledged before. She didn't know what to do with it. So she did something small and cowardly. She canceled the next session. The message was brief, deliberately vague, offering no real explanation. Even as she wrote it, she recognized it for what it was, avoidance disguised as practicality. Still, she sent it, then spent the rest of the day flinching at every notification. The reply came quickly. Simple, uncomplicated. No pressure, no disappointment, no invitation hidden between the lines. Just space. She found that harder to tolerate than anything else. That Friday, she went on the date anyway. The restaurant was carefully curated, dimly lit, everything arranged to feel intentional. Her date was thoughtful, attentive, easy to talk to. Under different circumstances, it might have worked. She might have allowed it to, but her attention refused to stay where it belonged. It drifted, again and again, back to something else. The memory of a small adjustment, 2 fingers at her shoulder guiding it into ease. The quiet precision of touch that didn't demand, didn't impose. The contrast became impossible to ignore. She sat there, responding when expected, participating in the rhythm of conversation, while internally something kept slipping out of alignment. The room smelled of citrus and smoke, the sound of glass and low voices filling the space, but none of it anchored her. When the conversation turned toward family, the truth surfaced without warning. She had a younger brother. The shift in tone was immediate. Sympathy, well-intentioned but heavy, entered the space between them. The ease they had built faltered under it. They both tried to recover, but something had already slipped out of place. By the end of the evening, the distance between them felt wider than when they had begun. When he asked if they should meet again, she declined gently, knowing the answer before he finished the question. He accepted it with grace. That made it easier, and somehow harder at the same time. Driving home, she cried without a clear reason, the emotion sitting somewhere between frustration and clarity. Not at him, not entirely at herself, but at the fact that wanting Iris hadn't simplified anything. It had only made it impossible to continue pretending. Rain blurred the windshield, the red light holding her in place as the city moved around her. The thought came, dry and almost detached. There were probably easier ways to arrive at this understanding. She didn't tell her therapist everything the following week. She circled it, offering partial truths, describing the canceled session, the date, the sense of disconnection. It was enough to signal change, but not enough to fully reveal it. Her therapist didn't reduce it, didn't make it smaller or easier to dismiss. She simply reflected it back, intact, leaving Mara to sit with the weight of it. Eventually, she rescheduled. By the time Thursday arrived, tension had settled deep inside her, a quiet charge she couldn't ignore. The evening had already darkened into rain by the time she parked outside the studio, the paper lantern casting a soft circle of light onto wet wood. She stayed in the car for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting in her lap, breathing in the stale mix of coffee and damp fabric, trying to decide whether she could walk back into that space without everything unraveling. Then she went inside. Iris was arranging blocks when she entered. The movement was familiar, grounding in its simplicity. When she turned, something flickered across her face, quick, unreadable, before settling back into the calm Mara recognized. And just like that, she was there again, standing at the edge of something she could no longer pretend not to feel. She remained exactly where she was, steady and unintrusive, a quiet presence that did not rush to fix or soften anything. That stillness held until Mara's breath stopped breaking apart, and her body felt like it belonged to her again, instead of something hastily reassembled. The session unfolded without performance, without the need to succeed at anything. Attention replaced effort. The floor, the pull of gravity, the simple fact of standing became enough. Mara noticed how her weight tipped forward, how she lived on the edge of motion, as if escape were always 1 second away. Her knees softened, her jaw loosened reluctantly, her arms hung without purpose. Even her breath was given permission to exist without being improved. Movement followed, slow and deliberate. Hands and knees, the rhythm of spine and breath, the quiet resistance in her body revealing itself piece by piece. Each time she tried to push further, to prove something, Iris's voice would arrive with the same calm correction, dialing her back from ambition into presence. It unsettled Mara how deeply she wanted approval, how instinctively she chased it, even here where nothing was being graded. Lying on her back, knees bent, she was asked to feel rather than think. The request irritated her until it didn't. When Iris placed a hand lightly against her ribs, the contact landed deeper than it should have, as if it had found a place untouched for too long. There was no demand in it, no expectation, just a quiet acknowledgement that her body existed and could be felt. Something inside her reacted with a strange, ancient recognition. Breath came unevenly, catching in her throat, stretching in unfamiliar directions. The shapes grew softer, supported, less about reaching and more about allowing. And then the tears returned, not tentative this time but forceful, uncontained. As though something long held in place had mistaken stillness for safety and finally surged forward. She tried to escape it, to apologize for it. But the room did not shift to accommodate her discomfort. Iris did not rush in, did not fill the moment with reassurance. A single request, quiet and steady, asked her to remain where she was for one more breath. A hand rested lightly between her shoulders. Not comforting, not coaxing, simply present. Under that touch, Mara felt something undeniable. There was no way to hide there, no way to perform or reframe or narrate her way out. The truth of her body, of her grief, existed plainly. She stayed. One breath became another. The intensity changed shape, less sharp, more like weather moving through. When it ended, nothing about her appearance suggested composure. She looked undone, as if something essential had been taken apart and left visible. Yet the quiet way Iris handed her water, the lack of ceremony around what had happened, made it feel less like collapse and more like something honest finally given space. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. Driving home, Mara noticed the smallest shift in her body. Her shoulders no longer pressed tight against her ears. The change unsettled her. It also pulled her back. The next session carried soreness, not just physical but something deeper, unfamiliar. The work remained gentle, focused on breath, on widening spaces that had long been held closed. Lying with her chest open, exposed in a way that felt almost indecent, she followed the rhythm Iris set, inhale and exhale, stretching into something steadier. Her mind resisted at first, clinging to distraction, to analysis, to the safety of understanding instead of experiencing. But gradually, something softened. The breath stopped being a task. Her ribs moved in ways she had not noticed before. When asked what she felt, the answer surprised her. Not calm, not relief, but anger. Anger that something so simple could work at all. That her body, ignored for so long, still responded. The memory of her brother came back differently then. Not as an event, not as the sharp edge of loss, but as something alive in small details. Leaves tangled in his hair, the worn softness of a sweatshirt, the sound of his voice layered with humor and defiance. By the third session, the familiarity of the space had begun to settle into her, even as she resisted it. The shapes, the quiet, the presence of another person who did not demand anything from her. It all began to feel anticipated, almost necessary. Touch shifted something again, a subtle adjustment of her hips that changed the entire structure of her body. It was not intimate, not in any obvious way, but it reached into a deeper system that recognized care and responded without permission. The reaction startled her, the way her body softened not by decision but by recognition. That moment left behind a quiet she could not ignore. Not emptiness, not absence, but the sudden lack of tension she had grown used to carrying. The sessions continued, each one revealing something small and exact. And alongside the grief, something else began to take shape. Something she could not yet name, but could feel building in the spaces where tension used to live. When her turn came, the words left her without ceremony. Her brother had died in a car accident the year before. Saying it aloud to strangers did not split her open the way she had feared. It felt closer to setting something down, a weight she had been carrying alone out of habit, as if everyone else were already burdened enough. Nothing remarkable followed. No sudden clarity, no shared catharsis. The coffee tasted burnt, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the room remained painfully ordinary. Yet when she stepped outside, she realized the ground had held. Grief could exist in plain spaces, spoken among people who had never known him, and still belonged to him fully. The next day, she sat at her kitchen table, while rain softened the edges of the fire escape and opened her laptop. She meant to write a few lines. Instead, the hours slipped past as memory took over. The letter formed itself around her brother, not around longing or confusion, but around the texture of who he had been. She wrote about his terrible driving, the way he missed exits because he was singing too loudly to notice. She wrote about the names he used for her, playful or careful depending on what he needed. She wrote about the quiet acts of care he performed without announcing them, about the strange cruelty of surviving someone who had known her before she became efficient at everything. The words came cleanly, without strategy. No attempt to convince, no effort to shape the story into something persuasive. Just truth, unadorned and steady. When she finished, the apartment looked unchanged, which felt almost offensive. The letter sat on the screen without greeting or signature, intimate in its lack of framing. She sent it before she could edit it into something safer. The message that followed was brief, almost dismissive of its own importance. Then came the waiting. Restless and sharp, every small sound from her phone tightening something in her chest. When the call finally came that evening, her voice felt unfamiliar in her own mouth. Hearing Iris through a phone instead of across a room altered the space between them without changing what lived inside it. Iris had read the letter. She spoke of it without embellishment, calling it true in a way that carried more weight than praise. Gratitude moved through Mara, unsteady and overwhelming. The silence between their words held without pressure, filled only with the quiet evidence of two separate rooms existing at once. Iris spoke about what stayed with her, small details that mattered because they had been seen. The way her brother called her by different names. The line about losing the person who knew her original self. The image of the folded sweatshirt. It felt as if the letter had been received not just as language but as something alive. They spoke for a long time without urgency. Pauses stretched naturally, without the need to repair them. Iris shared pieces of her own past, not as balance but as truth offered carefully. The ordinary labor of caring for someone who was fading, the quiet exhaustion of it. The realization, after loss, that she had been living slightly outside herself for too long to remember how to return. What helped her was not transformation, not anything dramatic, but practices that could hold reality as it was. Mara admitted the fear that what she felt might be inflated by circumstance, shaped by the container they had been in. Iris did not dismiss it. She only made space for the fact that conditions could influence something without creating it from nothing. The answer did not comfort her. It did not simplify anything. It only made the truth harder to avoid. When the call ended, the apartment felt altered in a quiet, irreversible way. Nothing visible had changed, yet something had begun to take shape, steady and undeniable. Days later, an invitation arrived. A café, neutral ground, no expectations pressed into it. She read the message several times before answering yes. The meeting unfolded simply. Coffee, small talk, the careful navigation of a space that no longer belonged to their previous roles. Beneath it all, something new settled into place, unspoken but present. They spoke openly about boundaries, about what had been, about what could only exist outside that structure. The difference between being guided and being chosen sat between them, clear and unavoidable. Fear surfaced, not dramatic but steady. The possibility that once the old framework disappeared, everything else might shrink into something smaller, easier to dismiss. Instead, it had become more ordinary, which made it more real. Rain began as they left, soft at first, then steady. They walked without rushing, the city moving around them in muted color and sound. Memory threaded through the moment, her brother's voice echoing in imagined commentary about the weather, irreverent and alive. They paused beneath a tree, the air damp and cool, the space between them no longer protected by distance or roles. When Iris spoke, it was direct and unguarded, the same steadiness now carrying something else beneath it. Mara answered without hesitation. The kiss was quiet, unremarkable to anyone else and everything to her. No rush of spectacle, no overwhelming force, just a deep, unmistakable easing, as if something held too tightly for too long had finally been allowed to release. Her body did not disappear from her awareness. It returned fully, present and undeniable. They walked on, slower now, the closeness no longer accidental. Nothing in her life had resolved itself. Loss remained. Work would continue to demand too much in polished language. Grief would still arrive without warning. But something fundamental had shifted. The separation she had maintained between healing and connection dissolved. Her body was no longer an obstacle to overcome. It was the place where everything lived. Loss, memory, desire, and the quiet reality of being seen and met without turning away. At home, the apartment held the faint scent of rain. The sweatshirt rested among her own clothes, no longer set apart. She touched it lightly, not to hold on, but to include it in the life continuing around it. Standing there, damp hair cooling against her neck, she felt her breath move fully through her for the first time in months. Her body no longer felt like a place she had been trapped inside. It felt like somewhere she could live,